As some of you will know, I had a disease outbreak in my 6-foot reef tank about 4 months ago that killed almost all of my fish. And for the last 3 months, I've been medicating the fish that survived while my tank remained fallow to ensure the parasite in the water completely died off. But this week, with the treatment period completed, I finally got to put my fish back in the tank. So in this video, I'll tell you about the problems I've had with quarantining fish, I'll show you how the tank has got on without any fish in it whatsoever for 3 months, and I'll tell you the main lessons I've learned and mistakes I've made during this whole process. First off then, let's start with the bad news. In total, I lost 10 fish to the parasite. Now several fish died before I even started treatment, and they were a white-tailed coal tang, a Bangai cardinal fish, a Tomini tang, Mrs. Clownfish, my starry blenny, and the royal grammer that brought the disease into the tank in the first place. Now to be completely honest with you, I was in denial at first, and I tried to sort the problem by adding a UV steriliser and just feeding the fish much more food. But that was never going to work, and I eventually came to the inevitable realisation that I needed to move the fish to a separate tank and treat the parasite. So I drained my main tank, removed all of the rockwork, and set about catching the surviving fish. Now doing so was actually relatively easy, and the only fish that I couldn't catch with a net was my mystery wrasse. Now he went into stealth mode for 2 days, but eventually he couldn't resist going into my fish trap, which meant I could finally start treatment in a hospital tank that I'd set up. But by this point I'd already lost 6 fish, in no small part because I'd wasted time. So the first lesson I learned then was that if you have a major disease outbreak, it's not going to go away on its own, and you need to act fast. The idea of stripping down the tank completely and catching all of my fish was a really daunting prospect at first, but actually in the end it was really easy and took probably about an hour all in, and ultimately if I'd done so sooner, I wouldn't have lost so many fish. Unfortunately though, things got worse before they got better. My gem tang, the most expensive fish I've ever bought, died the day after moving him to the quarantine tank, and my blue-striped pipefish followed soon after, meaning I'd lost 8 fish before I'd even started treatment. I treated the remaining fish with copper, which will kill white spot if used correctly, but unfortunately my scarlet hawkfish and mystery wrasse didn't cope well with the copper treatment at all, and died within a few weeks of me completing the 14-day copper treatment. Now because you have to leave your display tank fallow without any fish for an extended period of time, my original plan was to leave the fish in the quarantine tank for the rest of the 3-month period that I'd chosen to keep the tank fallow. But this is when I discovered my second mistake. It turns out that the white spot parasite can actually survive through a copper treatment in its cyst stage when it cysts onto the glass. Now that's not a problem if you take the fish straight out of the quarantine tank after treatment, but if you plan on leaving them in, when you remove the copper, they can then come out of their cyst stage and reinfect the fish. So in an ideal world, I would have transferred all of my fish out of the quarantine tank and into a new observation tank for the remaining 3-month fallow period. So to fix that then, I decided to run another 14-day copper period at the very end of my 3-month fallow period to ensure my fish were free from white spot when they went back into my tank. And at this stage I also decided to treat the fish with API General Cure, which treats brooklynella. Now I'm pretty sure the fish had white spot, but the clownfish, coal tang and Tomini tang all look like they had brook as well. Now identifying the parasite by eye isn't actually that easy, but the rule of thumb is that if you can count the spots, it's probably white spot, and if there are too many to count, it's probably brooklynella. The other most common parasite is velvet, but velvet kills very fast, and my fish died over the course of a few weeks, so I'm pretty confident that it wasn't that. Now before I show you the fish going back in the tank, I want to show you how the tank got on without any fish in it for 3 months. And I think it's fair to say it's a bit of a mixed bag. The corals themselves are actually all looking really healthy, which at the end of the day is the most important thing. I've carried on doing water changes of roughly 10% every other week, I've left all the filters on, and I've been adding fish food to the tank most days to try to stop my nitrate and phosphate from bottoming out. Now that worked with phosphate, but my nitrate did briefly drop to 0, so I started dosing liquid nitrate to bring that back up. But while the corals are doing well, it's fair to say I've had a couple of problems. The first of which is algae. My cleanup crew have taken care of most of the standard stuff like green hair algae, but I've had a big outbreak of this really annoying leafy algae that's called ulva. It's actually really easy to deal with, as most tangs and rabbitfish will eat it, and my rabbitfish was eating it before he left the tank, but my cleanup crew haven't shown any interest whatsoever, so the stuff has gone a bit feral. Although it is worth noting that this footage was taken with my lights at 100% intensity, so you can see what's going on more clearly, and it doesn't look anything like as ugly when my lights are in their normal settings. Now, touch wood, the ulva should probably disappear within a few weeks of my rabbitfish getting his grubby little mitts on and stuff, so I'm not too concerned about that, although to be fair he may need some help, so I'll probably add a tang at some point in the next month or so. The other problem I have though won't be as easy to deal with, and that is Aiptasia. I had a small amount of the stuff before all of this happened, so I bought some Berghia nudibranchs from berghiaonline.co.uk the day after I moved all of my fish to the quarantine tank. Because I keep wrasses, nudibranchs aren't usually an option for me because the wrasses will just eat them straight away. But with no fish in the tank, I thought the nudies might make a dent in my Aiptasia problem, but boy was I wrong. I also tried a couple of Aiptasia treatments, but there's just too many of the bastards, so I'll need to get an Aiptasia eating fish to do the job once and for all, and you'll need to stay tuned to see which fish I go for, and my choice might surprise one or two of you. And the only other issue that's cropped up is that the sand bed looks a bit messy. There's a light smattering of algae that makes the sand look a bit brown, but I'm pretty confident that will disappear when the fish go back in too. My wrasses were constantly disturbing the sand bed, so no doubt they'll go back to their old ways immediately. Now, while I couldn't have done much to stop the algae growing without fish in the tank, I could have helped the situation with my fallow period. According to the Humble Fish Forum, the fallow period for brook is 6 weeks, and the same is true for white spot if you run your tank temperature at 27 degrees. So while I chose to be cautious and go for 3 months, 6 weeks probably would have been enough, and that would have meant that my fish were back in their happy place much sooner, and I probably would have had less algae. And so finally then, it's time to move the treated fish from the quarantine tank back to the display tank. The only fish that survived were my 2-barred rabbitfish, a long-nosed hawkfish, a leopard wrasse, and a Wheeler's goby. Now, 4 fish in a 6-foot tank looks way understocked of course, but it's just so good having fish back in the tank. I'm generally more of a coral man than a fish man, but honestly it's been a bit boring looking at the tank without any fish in it. I love my coral choices and I've got some absolutely beautiful corals, but it turns out they just completely lose their edge when they don't have fish swimming between them. And I think part of that is that you can't really interact with corals in the same way that you can with fish. I did feed my corals occasionally during the fallow period, and there is a small physical response, but it's not the same interaction you get with the fish, which feel much more like a proper pet. Now, going forward, I haven't worked out what level of quarantine I'll be doing, and I think I'll probably assess it on a fish by fish basis. But what I will be doing at the very least is putting fish in an observation tank for a few weeks, and where I think it's necessary, I'll also treat certain fish with the appropriate medication. And that leads me to the last lesson I learned. Quarantine can be really hard. Now, don't get me wrong, had I quarantined the Royal Grammer before he went in, none of this would have happened. But actually I found treating fish to be a lot more difficult than I thought, and there are plenty of traps for the unwary that can really kick you while you're down. Now, I'm no expert on the subject of treating fish, so you will need to do your own research, but I'll put a few links in the description that I found really useful, so you can go and check them out if you're looking into this yourself. With all being well then, I'm hoping all of my problems are behind me, but I will of course update you with how I get on in the future, and if you want to see more of that, make sure you like and subscribe, and until next time, happy reefing.